Hello there, my RPG lovers, and welcome to another video. Lords of the Fallen came out in late 2023 and it got a very mixed reception. As a matter of fact, the game still has mixed reviews on Steam with 62% positive reviews and a very decent score of 77 on Metacritic, although the user rating is much lower with 6.7. Ironically, the last Lords of the Fallen game from 2014 had a similar reception, on Steam at least. Speaking of the first Lords of the Fallen, I really wanted to love that game, but no matter how many times I tried, I always end up quitting after about 5 to 10 hours max. I tried to get into that game multiple times in the past because I always thought I quit the game too early, but then I remember why I quit. It was just way too sluggish and slow, and I talked about this in my video where I covered all games from Deck 13 that you can check out. Even so, that game had some amazing visuals and atmosphere, and I guess that's why I really wanted to like it. Those huge armor plate sets were kinda crazy, and the artistic style in general was amazing in that game. Putting that aside, I was extremely excited for the new Lords of the Fallen game, but I decided not to get it on the release dates. After watching some videos about the game back then and how disappointed a lot of people were with this game, I kinda lost the interest for it. It still looked like the game that I could probably enjoy, but I decided to wait for some content updates and patches, which would hopefully make the game a lot better. It's been almost a year since the game has been released, and it had some massive patches in the meantime, so I thought this would be a perfect time to give the game a try. Unlike the first game, I actually completed the new Lords of the Fallen, so here is my full review for this Souls-like RPG.
I had no doubt in my assessment of you.
Just like the first game, Lords of the Fallen immediately grabbed my attention with some great visuals and atmosphere. It's not that surprising, considering that the game uses Unreal Engine 5. I got the Xbox Series X physical copy, but now I really want to get it on the PC as well. It looks very good on Xbox as well, and more importantly, it runs in 60 FPS, for the most part. It has some annoying frame drops here and there, and it occasionally stutters in some areas, but that wasn't enough to ruin my experience with the gameplay. It's stable for the most part. This game is certainly a lot darker compared to the original, and for a good reason considering the setting. The original game from 2014 had more saturated and eye-popping colors, while the new game adopted a much grimier look. This game is kind of unique when it comes to the artistic style because it essentially has two full-blown artistic styles on top of each other. That's one of the main features in the game, which heavily affects the gameplay itself. The player gets a special lamp that allows him to see the second world, which is basically stacked on top of the normal world. Speaking of stacks, how would you like to stack some new and old games in your library without spending a ton of money? Instant Gaming, the sponsor of this video, is not just another marketplace. You'll buy keys from authorized resellers, and as the name would suggest, the delivery is instant. I've been a member since 2015, and I saved a lot of money over the years when I was not a content creator who could afford a lot of new games. It's a trustworthy website with 24/7 customer service and 4.7 score on Trustpilot. You can find keys for pretty much all gaming platforms like PC, PlayStation, Xbox or Nintendo Switch. From currently popular to best-selling and upcoming games which are available for pre-order, Instant Gaming has it all. You can save 23% on the upcoming Space Marine 2 or 17% on the amazing Black Myth Wukong. All of that and thousands of more games await you on Instant Gaming, so use my link in the description to check it out and get huge discounts on your next purchase. Axiom and Umbral, those are the names for the two worlds in the game. Two worlds, remember that?
'Tis dangerous to travel alone these days. Give me 100 in gold and mayhap I will let you live.
The dark blue color is dominant in the Umbral world, which kinda gets boring to look at after a while, to be honest. However, it's supposed to be unsettling, so it makes sense in a way. And you should not spend a lot of time in this realm unless you're doing something specific because it becomes progressively more dangerous. The normal world is much more pleasing for the eyes, but both of these realms will have some stunning architecture and vistas, which can make your jaw drop. Every once in a while you're going to stop and stare at your surroundings or in the distance. Lords of the Fallen has a decent amount of unique looking areas. Some of these areas look very generic though, especially in the early game. But the game will try to switch up the vibe with different levels like the swamps, the area that's on fire, mountainous cliffs, different castles, dungeons and caves, the snowy area, etc. Like I said, I think it has a decent visual variety, but it's also kind of generic with some areas in between those unique levels. This has nothing to do with the level design itself, we'll talk about that in the gameplay section soon enough. The Umbra world is a different story because it has the same visual style everywhere you go, and it's very good or even amazing sometimes. The bosses and enemies have some cool designs, but the game really struggles with the enemy variety in general. Overall, I really like how the game looks in general. Now let's talk about the story. Eons have passed after the followers of Orias defeated the Dark God Aedir and sealed him away. Judge Cleric established the Order of Hallowed Sentinels to watch over 5 magical beacons to prevent Aedir from reviving, but these sentinels became corrupted over the ages. You play as a lamp bearer and you're supposed to cleanse the 5 beacons by defeating the sentinels and absorbing the Aedir essence at each beacon. When you put it like that, it's a simple story that's easy to follow. But Lords of the Fallen storytelling is similar to Souls-like games, where NPCs just mumble some random bullshit about whatever and you're supposed to figure it out.
What's a poor, rejected disciple to do now, I ask you?
No, but seriously, the story is fine, and I like when you have a clear goal from the very beginning. All you have to do is look up in the sky and figure out how to get to those beacons. Easier said than done because it's not actually that straightforward, at least when it comes to a couple of these beacons. As for the rest of the story, side quests and dialogue, it's all up to you if you're even going to care. There are a handful of memorable NPCs, and you can hear some interesting things about the lore. Although the voice acting is pretty flat, I would say that some voices don't really match the character looks, but that can be very subjective, so you be the judge.
When all along you were a divine instrument sent by him to deliver my death and rebirth.
If you're headed for Pilgrim's Perch, friend, the Hallowed Sentinels don't welcome everyone. Not even a faithful pilgrim who's crossed countless miles of land and sea to join them.
To tell you the truth, most of these female characters in Souls-like RPGs remind me of girls I used to date back in the day. I don't know what the hell they're talking about most of the time, but they're hot, so I pretend to listen.
And they can bolster the power of my blood further still.
As for some other features related to the story and lore, you can also do this cool thing with your lamp, which allows you to see past events.
Come to Aureus, my child. Yes. Hands in my embrace.
What's interesting about this, the Surge 2 also had an identical feature. If you didn't know already, the first Lords of the Fallen game was developed by Deck 13 and CI Games. Deck 13 continued to work on their new IPs like the Surge series and Atlas Fallen, while CI Games created a subsidiary called Hexworks to work on the new Lords of the Fallen game. The fact that the new Lords of the Fallen game and the Surge 2 have an identical feature is quite interesting if you ask me, even though the studios have nothing to do with each other for quite some time.
It's impossible.
Now let's talk about the most important thing in Lords of the Fallen, the gameplay. You start the game by making and customizing your own character with a decent customization system. It's your regular Souls-like character creation, and what you choose to select here doesn't have to shape your entire character builds. I started as a Werewolf class, which has a lot of strength and carries a big two-handed sword, but by the end of the game I completely switched my build to even stronger two-handed melee warrior. I got you there, didn't I? Yeah, I played through the whole game as a strength-focused character, but I figured out that was a mistake because some of the weapons I really wanted to use require some other stats like Inferno for example. I just dumped the majority of points into strength and the rest of it in vitality for increased health. That's literally how I beat the entire game. Speaking of which, I also didn't use any guides, I almost went completely blind into this game. I did watch some gameplay videos and playthroughs when the game came out, up to the second boss, but that's about it.
Dude, I don't know where to go.
I never farmed Vigor, which is the equivalent to Souls in this game, and I also never used summons, so I think I did a very organic playthrough. If I didn't beat all bosses by myself, I don't think that will make a good enough review, to be honest. My brute force approach worked for 85% of this playthrough, but I hit a brick wall near the end because I couldn't for the life of me figure out how to access one of the last beacons. But first, let's finally start talking about the combat before we get into the nitty-gritty side of things. First of all, it's way better compared to the first game, which is a very low bar to set, but still. Controlling your character feels pretty good in this game, in almost all situations. The controls are not as responsive as Elden Ring for example, but still, it's responsive enough for the gameplay to feel smooth. Attack animations with large weapons like swords and axes are very satisfying, and I think I even like the axe moveset a bit more. But I already upgraded this sword to +10, which also has a higher strength scaling, and I couldn't be bothered to do the same for the axe. Your experience with the combat in these kinds of games depends a lot on your weapon choice. Since the moment I got this massive sword, I never looked back. That's a lie actually, because like I said before, I really wanted to use some similar weapons, but I lacked the Inferno stats. So if you're one of those players who just dump a lot of points into strength, I suggest you save some points for stats like Inferno or Agility, because a lot of these cool weapons require multiple stats. Most regular NPCs have telegraph animations which are easy to anticipate if you play carefully. Figuring out when to dodge or parry has a specific learning curve which is a bit awkward at first. The combat definitely has a dose of floatiness, if that's even a word, but I certainly wouldn't describe the combat as floaty in general. When it clicks with you, I think it works pretty good. Dodging can feel a bit sluggish though, because some of your attacks have very long animation lock, which can't be cancelled. But it's more about figuring out that specific window to dodge attacks. It depends on the fight, but a lot of unique boss abilities have to be dodged late into their animation. That can be very tricky when you're fighting a boss with some very fast attacks, but like I said, it really needs to click with you, and the first step is getting accustomed to controls. Or just grab a shield and try to block most attacks, whatever works best for you. I think the impact on hit is just serviceable, it's certainly not amazing. Although I'm pretty sure this used to be even worse before they added some huge patches to the game. Speaking of things which improved the combat and gameplay in general, I know that the game had massive issues before with gravity deaths. You could easily fall off the map by simply using your attacks because your character steps forward with each attack. But after these massive patches, it's very hard to fall off the map by just attacking. As you can see here, it's almost impossible. You could attribute this to the lack of polish on release, but small things like this can turn away a lot of people who wanted to play the game. You won't have any of these issues if you decide to jump into the game right now. As with many new Souls-like games, enemies have a stagger bar which can be broken by parrying or by using some very strong attacks like running strong attack or a special strong attack. When the stagger bar is broken, you get to deal some free damage with unique animations. As for the parry mechanic, I didn't like it at first, so I completely ignored it, until I got to fight this motherfucker. I usually like to learn parry mechanics in Souls-like games, but I just didn't like how it feels in this game. Well, I was completely wrong, because I started loving it close to the end of the game, when I actually put in some effort to learn the timing. When you successfully parry the attack, you get this special blue light and sound effect, but bosses require you to do it multiple times in order to break the stagger bar. There are only a handful of bosses in the game that kill me a lot of times, but the rest of them are not very hard. They are not easy by any means, and I don't think I killed any boss on my first try, but besides those couple of bosses, I was never really stuck. And listen, when I say I didn't kill any boss on my first try, that's only true for actual big boss fights. I'm not counting these so-called boss fights, which you immediately get as regular NPCs after you beat them. They can be challenging as well for sure, but compared to the big boss fights, they're a joke. The boss fights in Lords of the Fallen can leave some bad first impressions early in the game. The first boss fight is very good and fair, but you're going to fight one of the worst bosses in the early game that can make you hate Lords of the Fallen. I hated this boss with a burning passion, and it's easily one of the worst boss fights in the game. I'm sure that I could probably handle this boss with no issues now after I finished the game, but when I got to fight him for the first time, it was very frustrating. The animations on some of his attacks are very stiff and hard to predict. Combined with the camera issues that you can have and the limited size of this arena, it can be hard to see what the hell is going on, which is not exactly what you want in the early game, or in general, as a matter of fact. A couple of other boss fights have a similar issue with the visibility and limited fights arenas, like this dude for example. But for the most part, I didn't have a lot of issues with the visibility in fights. Sometimes the bosses go crazy with a bunch of attacks at the same time, which does create some visual clutter, but it's not a huge issue. Another early boss fight that I hated was Hushed Saints, but I later started liking this boss fight a lot more. By the point when you reach this boss, you're still learning the feel of basic mechanics like when to dodge, and this fight will probably be your first true test. This is the first beacon that I cleansed, but I'm pretty sure nothing is stopping you from going in a totally different direction and close another beacon first. Although I'm pretty sure those enemies in different areas have more health and they can deal more damage, even if you face the same enemy type. The Hollow Crow has to be the worst boss fight in the game. It's mostly a gimmicky fight, but it takes way too long and it's not fun at all. This fight has 3 phases and none of them is even remotely fun, just long and tedious. On the other side, there is another gimmicky fight which I did like because it's very well designed. This goofy looking idiot has some regular boss abilities, but you also have to do specific things on this map in order to beat him. Speaking of gimmicks, some bosses and enemies require you to use special lamp abilities before you can even fight them, like having to dissolve a bubble before you can even damage a boss or an enemy. I'm still not sure if I even like this mechanic, but it's definitely unique. It can be very frustrating to find the damn thing and destroy it before you actually start fighting the boss. It can feel very cheap. As for my favorite boss fights, those would be the Tancred, Judge Cleric and the Light Trapper. Tancred was the first boss which gave me a lot of trouble because both of his phases can be pretty challenging. Judge Cleric was somewhat easier, but I think this fight was very well designed despite the visual clutter in the second phase. The Light Trapper is quite possibly the hardest boss fight in the game, at least it was for me. I was stuck for a couple of hours on this boss fight and I really hated it at first. But it's a very good fight in general, if not a bit tedious, because the first phase with a dragon that has 2 abilities which take forever to end. You basically have 2 lives in Lords of the Fallen and 2 chances to bring the boss down before you have to reset the fights. The Umbral world has its own unique enemies, but it will only take a couple of hours of gameplay to see all of them. When you're fighting those elite enemies that just pretend to be bosses, the game likes to add another NPC in the fight, or even the same type of enemy. Fighting 2 enemies at once is usually not that fun, especially as a slow 2-handed sword character. However, one of my most favorite fights in the game is when you're fighting these 2 abiding defenders. It's one of the rare fights in the game against lower tier bosses, which I liked a lot. I mean, sure, the game even uses these types of enemies as regular NPCs, but only in a couple of more areas that you can even skip. Which brings us to my biggest problem with the gameplay, the enemy types, or the lack of them. What I found really frustrating when it comes to this is how the game immediately starts using the bosses as regular enemies. I mean, this is something that even the best games in this genre do, but Lords of the Fallen just turns it up to 11. As soon as you finish the boss fight, you're immediately going to fight that same enemy type in the next zone, or even 2 of them at once. The only difference is the much lower health bar and the damage they deal, I think. It's not something which happens in the beginning and the early game only, it happens throughout the whole game, and it becomes very annoying very fast. It feels like a very cheap gameplay design after it happens for 30 plus hours constantly, and I started skipping a lot of these fights every time I could. They are not even badly designed, most of them are pretty good, but it just gets boring to fight them over and over again. This can work for some enemies for sure, but it also diminishes that menacing feeling you get from a boss fight. They become less unique if you take them down in a couple of hits, right after the quote-unquote boss fight. It's not anything new when it comes to AA RPGs, a lot of them struggle on this particular field. Then again, I'm pretty sure Lords of the Fallen was a AAA RPG with a big budget, at least I remember the announcements for it, which described it as such. Technically, the game has a decent number of enemy types with some pretty cool visual designs, but I still got tired of fighting most of them by the end of the game, especially those in the Umbral world. Those enemies definitely lack the variety and it becomes very boring to fight them over and over again. The combat has a great combo system that you can utilize and it's very flexible. You can combine heavy and fast attacks as long as you have the stamina. You can also charge the heavy attack and even do it in the middle of the combo. There are running light and heavy attacks as well as special weapon attacks which usually take a while to perform but they are very strong. I really like how you can quickly go from the dodge to the attack because it feels pretty snappy, especially with the Great Axe. The timing and your positioning will determine how successful you are in fights, which is nothing new when it comes to these types of games, but it's well done in Lords of the Fallen. That being said, I usually just stick to one or two very strong attacks and I abuse the shit out of them. There are some annoying enemy types, but most regular NPCs will offer you a very fair fight. The game uses those cheap tricks with enemy placement, but you can usually figure out what to expect behind tight corners and blind angles. Again, nothing new when it comes to Souls-likes. There is magic in the game as well, but I have no clue if it's actually good. As for the itemization, I think the game does a pretty good job. I've got a lot of different weapons and armor sets by the end of the game. You can only upgrade weapons and some of them have special abilities. However, unlocking these special weapon abilities is not so straightforward like in most Souls-like games. You have to work for it a little bit by doing some specific quests and upgrading the weapon at the smiths. I only know this because I looked it up, I still haven't unlocked any special weapon ability. I actually like how this works because it gives you a greater sense of progression when you finally do it, and those abilities look very cool and rewarding. I was also invaded a couple of times while I was playing the game, and this guy thought I'm going to be a very easy target. He was flashing his fancy weapon ability, but that didn't help him a lot. Then again, I also got invaded in a very annoying moment and this guy completely destroyed me. I'm not sure if the PvP is any good, but I can tell you one thing, when you hit the player or get hit, it happens instantly, no lag at all. And if you played any From Software games, you know how bad the netcode can be and the delay of hitting someone can be extremely bad. Lords of the Fallen has these multiplayer features like in Dark Souls games, you can either help them to kill bosses, invade them or play together. I played solo for the entire playthrough. I think Lords of the Fallen has some very cool attention to detail. For example, you can get hit by the Umbral enemies if you're using the lamp long enough, which causes you to get pulled in the Umbral world immediately, which essentially means that you died from one hit. Because you suck. This can be annoying, but it's also very cool if you think about it when you're not mad. It can be an effective jump scare as well, and it can create some slightly tense moments in the game. You also have to use the lamp constantly in order to pass through some gates, which you can't open in the Axiom worlds. The way these two worlds overlap each other is just amazing from the technical side of things, and these kinds of moments make the gameplay very unique. I don't believe I ever experienced anything similar in other games. I mean, sure, the Umbral world has its own problems, which I pointed out, but it's still very unique and ambitious. The patches that I mentioned before also included some new gameplay modes like Boss Rush and Randomizer. This was a huge update which can completely change how you play the game, and they really put some thought behind these modes. They were not just slapped on top of the game. I usually don't like randomizer modes in these kinds of games because it usually messes with the progression system a lot, and not in a good way. I personally like to have more control over my character progression with a tight itemization system controlled by the game from the beginning to the very end. In other words, I don't like RNG progression in general. That being said, I absolutely love this new gameplay mode in Lords of the Fallen because it's very well done. I didn't complete a new playthrough with advanced game modifiers, but from what I got to play so far, I really like it. You can have total control over these modifiers and choose which one you want to use. There are many different modifiers to try out, which can change different aspects of the game, like the amount of vestiges you can use, random enemy placement, loot, and so on. You can select that all weapons you find come pre-upgraded according to your current level, which is an amazing modifier that I really like. It's an amazing update in general, which gives the game a lot of replay value, and I plan to complete another playthrough with advanced game modifiers. It's great to see that developers care so much about this game, and they were doing everything in their power to improve it as much as possible. Now let's talk about the level design. The whole gist of the level design is making the player manipulate both of these worlds in order to progress through different levels. Sometimes you'll have to find the ladder that you can only see in the Umbral world, or solve a simple puzzle to open a door. There is some very light platforming that you have to do by moving some platforms with a lamp. The more time you spend in the Umbral world, the more powerful enemies start chasing you, but you also get a stronger multiplier for collecting vigor. I was hoping to see some interesting stronger enemy types when this happens, but it doesn't. It's just this Reaper guy who is very annoying to fight. I think it's a missed opportunity to create some very cool and challenging fights for those who are purposely trying to stay in the Umbral world. It would create a high risk, high reward type of a gameplay loop, but that's not what we got. The map in the game could probably be compared to Dark Souls 3 because it felt to me like it's similar in size and similar design philosophy as well. I know that can be said for many Souls-like out there, but not all of these games do a great job with the level design like Lords of the Fallen. The game doesn't hold your hand at all, which can be frustrating sometimes if you get stuck. But I don't know why these games are hell-bent on avoiding some simple RPG features like a quest log or something that will just vaguely track the quest progress and the main quests. Is it too much to ask for? I don't know. As you would expect, there are many shortcuts and little passages which connects a lot of different areas. You also get a hub area early in the game, and it's like a crossroads area basically, where you can take multiple paths to progress further. I was enjoying exploring the map for the most part, and I didn't have to Google anything until very late in the game, like I said before. Some areas will require special keys that you could easily miss, which prevents you from progressing further. I had to Google the location for one of those keys, because I couldn't find it anywhere. But this goes back to my quest log rant I had. Most of these problems wouldn't be an issue if such a feature existed. I'm not asking much here, just a simple quest text in the quest log, which tells you what your next quest is. You don't even need to get in-depth info or anything.
Dude, I don't know where to go.
Anyway, the vestige system is basically a bonfire from Dark Souls, but the game also allows you to place your own vestige on specific points on the map. These vestiges are cheap, so you can just buy them in your hub area, and you also get them from defeating bosses and some enemies. Although I think this mechanic is a little bit redundant. Why not just include another vestige on these places, rather than forcing you to do it? The run back to some bosses is very long, so you always have to make sure to have some vestige seeds on you. It's a minor inconvenience, because the item is easily obtainable, but I found myself without a vestige seed more than a couple of times, and if you die, it can be very annoying to run back. The music in the game is very forgettable, except the main theme that plays. I really don't remember any specific soundtracks from the game, which is a bit disappointing. I like the main theme though, and if all other tracks were like this, it would be an amazing soundtrack. The sound effects are serviceable like I said before, but nothing to write home about. I think a lot of developers of Souls-like games are underestimating the importance of sound design. If you ask me, Demon's Souls Remake still has the best sound design in this genre, hands down. Yes, it's even far better than Elden Ring or any similar game that came out recently, it's insanely good. I feel like that game didn't get nearly enough praise for the sound and the visual design. As a matter of fact. They actually beat From Software at their own game, to be honest. The sound design in Lords of the Fallen has some cool effects, like when you're using the lamp, but the combat sound effects are just serviceable at best. I already talked about the voice acting before, it's a bit underwhelming but not bad.
I've got many a scar to prove it.
And that will be it for my Lords of the Fallen 1 year later retrospective review.
I had no doubt in my assessment of you.
I enjoyed this game a lot, despite all the issues I mentioned in the review, and I plan to play this game a lot more with advanced game modifiers. It takes a while to click with you, but when it does, you start liking the game a lot more. At least that was the case with me. Anyway, tell me your opinion about Lords of the Fallen in the comments below. Did you play it or not? Be sure to subscribe if you enjoyed the video. You can also support me by becoming a YouTube member or a Patreon. I also have some cool t-shirts and hoodies in the theme of the channel, so check that out as well. Huge thanks to all of my current supporters, and I'll see you in the next one.